I worked for Paul Martin for over 25 years. The first thing he talked to me about when I met him, equal opportunity for Indigenous people. The last thing he was desperately trying to get done before his government fell in 2005, the Kelowna Accord. His work on behalf of First Nations continues to this day, centered on education, healthcare, and general well-being. If you're a regular listener to our pod, you know that our presenting sponsor, TELUS, believes that the needs of business and the need to address social divides do not stand apart. And they also share a strong commitment to the well-being of Indigenous peoples through the power of digital connectivity. Working in partnership with Indigenous governments, TELUS services 178 Indigenous communities in BC, Alberta, and Quebec. 56 of those communities are connected to TELUS Pure Fiber, as well as an additional 87 reserves, treaty lands, and self-governed lands. The stats sound fancy, but they're more than just numbers. High-speed internet makes a hell of a difference when it comes to quality of life, and it's something that just many of us take for granted. The benefits have been language revitalization, better access to health care, economic development, and jobs. More jobs. I like talking about real-life examples, and here's just one. In 2019, TELUS brought Pure Fiber to the Esketum First Nation in central BC. It's already enabled other ways of preserving their culture and has resulted in greater opportunity for local businesses. Connectivity has also vastly improved how the nation's government communicates with its membership. And that's really just one small part of the story. It's all in TELUS's just released Indigenous Connectivity Report. You can read it for yourself at telus.com/Indigenous Connectivity. Hello to all you beautiful Herle Burlyites out there. Time for today's two-part pod, a double podcast, a daily double. And fittingly, although I'm admittedly a little late with this, I'd like to begin with a nod and a heartfelt tribute to Alex Trebek. We are watching pre-recorded episodes until Christmas time, Alex, but based on the reaction from my friends, you're missed already. All right, for part one, we have Adrienne Spafford as our guest. Adrienne is CEO of Addictions and Mental Health Ontario, and she has a long history, not only as a seasoned healthcare leader, but as a senior advisor in government. We're going to be talking about the impacts of COVID on mental health, but not only that, we'll also chat more broadly about our system and strategy for addictions and mental health care. What are we getting right? Where can we do better? Part two of the pod is a special edition of the political panel with our comms and campaign gurus, Jenny Byrne and Scott Reed. We are très fatigués of talking about COVID. That's French for we can't think of anything goddamn new to say on the topic, and we don't want to bore the crap out of you. We're also sick of arguing week after week about Trump, and you're sick of hearing it. So today we're doing an all mailbag show, answering all your burning political questions and sharing some questionable stories from our past. And please stay with us right to the end for week 2 of Hey You. Hey You is our new segment where each of us throws a question out into the social media void for a politician or public figure. Last week we did it, and get this, no one answered us. Nobody took the bait. Nada. Zilch. Total silence. So naturally, we're doing it again this week because Hey You will not be deterred. Adrienne Spafford, welcome to the Herle Burly.
Thanks so much for having me, David. I'm happy to be here and picking up on your recognition of Alex Trebek. My mom actually met Alex Trebek a long time ago. She was a librarian and worked in the public library system, and he came for an event there, and they had quite a long interaction, and he is a Canadian personality who will be missed.
Yeah, your mom must have told that story many times.
She's told it many, many, many times, and she's probably telling it a lot these last couple of weeks.
Yeah, I bet. But how are you? Where are you? You're in Toronto?
I'm in Toronto. I think overall, I'm good. I anytime anyone asks me that question, I've got to acknowledge I've got a home, I've got a job, I've got a family around me. I'm definitely not at risk of isolation. I could stand to have an hour or two of quiet in my day per week. But this has been an extraordinary challenge. I don't think many marriages in this generation are meant for, or we're not built to be in marriages where we're sharing this much space with one another. So I think it's testing a lot of them from the workload perspective. From March to July, my workload probably quadrupled, and it was already a busy job. I'm so lucky to have a job. It's been a lot. It's been a heavy 8 months, like it's been for everyone.
Right. And now you're in full lockdown in Toronto. What does that mean for you?
I don't see a huge, so I am able to choose to adhere to the public health measures for the most part. So primarily what it's mean for me is I need to call ahead if I want to buy something, and I have to do curbside pickup rather than being able to go into a store already. It's not enjoyable for me to go to a restaurant with a 2.5-year-old and a 6-year-old. So we weren't hanging out on outdoor patios anyways. Really the difference is in the retail, and I'm just fingers crossed that the schools can stay safely open, because that has made a world of difference for my daughter's well-being and for our entire family, having her in class learning.
Yeah, I bet. And you feel comfortable that she's there and you're not worried about it? Big class sizes and all?
I wish the class size was smaller, that's for sure. I think the teachers and the administration are doing a phenomenal job. When I got the email, because I've been in roles where I've been in charge of putting on, relatively large events. And when I got the email from the principal heading back to school in September, I never thought about this. I thought, holy shit, like a principal literally had to completely change the operations of their school, where and where you're going out, parents and then drop their child off in these designated circles and then walk out another gate of the field. Like it's been a complete transformation of all of the kids' day. And I just think, kudos to the teacher and the administration for getting that done under extraordinary circumstances. As long as there has been a couple cases just this week in her school. And as long as those aren't leading to transmission within the school, then I'm comfortable. I think taking my daughter out of it, the importance of the public education system, I don't think I recognized it honestly as profoundly as I do, having gone through the pandemic. Like that is the venue where kids get identified as early as possible for special needs, where they get identified if they're needing children's aid support. And when we're locking things down and kids aren't in school, you're missing out on identifying, pretty severe issues that can impact their entire life and can be addressed if you intervene early.
Cool. Okay, so let's talk about mental health a bit. And Adrienne, I'm going to, as I sometimes do in these interviews, throw myself on the mercy of the court. I am far, far, far from a subject matter expert, much closer to being a patient than an expert. So a lot of these questions are going to be pretty simplistic for my purposes. So can we start off with, when we talk about mental health, what are we talking about? What are we referring to?
Yeah, no, I actually think that's a really important question. And I think there's two answers to that. And I think if I do my job today, you'll hear me come back to this. But everybody has mental well-being or not, like we have physical well-being. So, are we eating healthily enough? Are we getting exercise? that's on, we tend to think of that on the physical side. On the mental well-being side, are we socializing? Are we able to take enough time for ourselves? Do we have appropriate boundaries for things that can cause us anxiety or depression? So everyone interacts with their own mental health, and I tend to call that mental well-being. I think what gets ignored too much is that there is also mental illness, that there are people whose lives are at risk because of an illness like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, people who are experiencing psychoses, which would, someone experiencing psychoses is a person who's someone not experienced. So someone like you and me, who is not mentally ill, is walking down the street, and you see someone who appears to be in a fit of rage or talking about really paranoid thoughts or screaming. That's oftentimes someone in psychosis. And so mental health is everyone's mental health. Mental illness is someone who has a diagnosis and needs a combination of medication and psychosocial, basically therapy supports to be able to be well.
Okay. Now, I was pretty surprised to see that you wrote an article in the Toronto Star in which you said that there was as big a mental health crisis in Canada as there was a COVID crisis in Canada. How can that be? I mean, COVID is everywhere. Everybody's afraid of getting it, and hundreds of thousands of people have it. And
yeah, I think that. So I always want to stay away from like competing one disease or pandemic or crisis against another. I think the point is that the mortality rate of people who have mental illness are way more likely to die early than people don't. On average, someone with a mental illness dies 20 years earlier than someone who does not have a mental illness. A report just came out yesterday by Dr. Paul Kurdiak that says for someone who goes into the emergency department for an alcohol-related issue, either needing to detox, that's a stigmatizing word, but people know what it means, needing to detox or needing services, that 1 in 20 of them die within a year. If they go to emergency department 5 times or more a year, 1 in 10 die. 10% of people die within a year. Kids are waiting up to 2.5 years for access to services when they are suicidal, when they are self-harming, when they are taking drugs and completely isolated from their families. And so I call it a crisis because people are dying because we don't have the services that people need not to die and not to deteriorate to the point that they die. And we have done the work of reorganizing and funding up volumes of services for people in other chronic conditions like cardiac care, heart care, like palliative care, like cancer. And there's no reason we can't do it for mental health and addiction. And until we do that, we're just going to keep being in crisis. So the wait times for services are too long, and depending on where you live, you don't even have access to the services you might need.
we think about these things differently, don't we? I mean, if I need a hip replacement, nobody questions the validity of that.
Yeah.
And it's seen as a natural thing. If I'm an alcoholic, it's more likely to be seen as my fault, isn't it? Like I've made myself an alcoholic. So
Yes.
it's not, I didn't make myself need a hip replacement, but I made myself an alcoholic. We view these things differently, don't we?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think, I talk about that as stigma. I think stigma impacts.
Well, wait a second. What's wrong with stigmatizing alcoholism? I mean, it always has been stigmatized. It's a weakness. It's something to be ashamed of, isn't it?
I think so. What's wrong with it if you're just looking at it purely economically? So let's start there. Is that it costs hundreds of thousands of lost productivity days by not treating it. It costs huge amount of dollars for our healthcare system that could be better spent in dealing with people at the acute stage. And then, I don't believe that someone chooses to live a life that is defined by their need for a particular substance, whether it's alcohol, whether it's opioids. There are, and I'm not a physician, but there are, as I understand it, mixture of genetic factors as well as life context that puts you more at risk of having addictive behaviors. And so this is not a personal failure. This is not a personal fault. You can see I get quite emotional, sort of feeling like I need to defend that, because I think in 2020, we should be so far beyond the point where we see this as a personal failure. At the point people are at where they're needing to access services, they're either drinking or using drugs because they don't want to be sick. Because let's veer over to opioids, or we can stay in the alcohol realm. If you are severely addicted to alcohol, then when you wake up in the morning, you need to drink to feel like you can get through the day. Like, it's a very dangerous thing to withdraw from alcohol without supports, either medical or psychosocial supports. People can die from withdrawing from alcohol. And so I think we need to really be switching our lens in the way over the courses of generations we have done with other areas of stigma, like HIV/AIDS, and say, this is not a life choice. No one chooses to live this way, to lose their family, to alienate their family, to lose their job, to lose their housing. Individuals are sick and they need support. And the people I represent in my job provide support on a daily basis to people that are showing up, and every single day that person is choosing to live, and they're choosing to live against the odds.
Right. So, what is the relationship between addiction and mental health? I mean, I might personally be addicted to 2 or 3 things. Does that mean I have a mental illness?
No, it is. If you have one, you do not necessarily have the other. However, the connection is that if you do have a mental illness or you're struggling with your mental well-being, research says there's a higher chance of likelihood that you will also have an addiction. So, I think it's pretty typical, without being a doctor or researcher, I think I can say it's pretty typical that someone struggling with anxiety in particular sees cannabis or, 3 glasses of wine in the evening as a really good antidote to bringing down what you're dealing with that anxiety in your chest. The problem becomes when that substance use starts to impact, when drinking or smoking cannabis or vaping, consuming it in whatever form, edibles, when that starts to impact your life, right? When that starts to impact your family, when that starts to impact your job, And so it's not like a one-to-one. But we do know that people are more likely to experience both a mental illness and an addiction if they have the other. And the other thing why we think it's important to talk about it together is historically across Canada, and different provinces are at different regions of addressing this. Services for mental health and addiction were largely built up by community providers. Like, it was a volunteer community in a neighborhood that saw there was an unmet need, because traditional physicians and hospitals tended to turn people away. You would be shocked at the number of people that we see in our work that can't get access to a family doctor, a nurse practitioner, or a hospital in an emergency because of their substance use.
Okay. Let's talk about drugs, if we could, for a bit, Adrienne.
Yeah.
First of all, marijuana. Have you seen any change for the positive or negative on mental health since the legalization of marijuana?
I mean, I think the biggest benefit of the legalization of marijuana is actually more so on the decriminalization of cannabis. So I personally don't think that it serves a productive purpose for people to be going to jail or needing to go to court for the possession of a small amount of really any substance for usage. And so the benefit is that fewer people are going to jail, and particularly overwhelmingly those people were Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So I think the largest impact of cannabis policy has been improvements from an equity perspective and improvements in fewer people to going to jail. I will say that where many people see cannabis as a relatively neutral substance, it is highly problematic from an addiction perspective for children and youth. And there's a phenomenal addiction organization for youth called Pine River Institute up in Shelburne, Ontario. And the kids there are phenomenal. They've dealt with often huge amounts of trauma in their life, child abuse, sexual abuse. And they're learning the skills they need to be able to live lives that are full and productive and have families and jobs or whatever. And the number one addiction that Pine River deals with is cannabis. And just behind that is video gaming. So when we think about where we think the substances that we think are harmful, it's, I think, always important that we're thinking about, particularly for kids and youth, where the brain's still developing. Some of these substances, like cannabis, that we see as neutral, are actually changing brains, which is work that will need to be undone as adults.
Geez, I wonder what I would have been like. Okay, let's talk about prescription drugs.
Okay.
Start with, what is the prevalence of depression and anxiety? How many of us are on antidepressants right now in Canada?
Oh, I don't have the exact number in front of me, David. I think it's a good question as to whether it's too many and what I do know is that there'd probably be a lot fewer of us, myself included, on prescription medication for anxiety, depression, or mild to moderate mental health conditions if publicly funded alternatives to medication were actually available, right? So family doctors, and this is not judgmental on family doctors, it's what they're trained to do, what they can do for someone who comes in and can't afford to pay $220 an hour for therapy, for evidence-based therapy with a private practitioner, is they can prescribe a medication. And oftentimes there's benefits to that medication. What family doctors do not have access to right now, largely, this is starting to get better, but largely and historically, family doctors don't have access to an easy number they can call where someone like me, like you, can get access to publicly funded free therapy services that could be used both in combination with a medication, with a plan to, once you're through a crisis, like for instance, when my father passed away, I really needed some additional support. And I think that's valid. Like sometimes you need additional, like when I had my kids, my blood pressure went out of whack and I needed a little bit of blood pressure medication to bring it back in control. And then I didn't need it anymore. So I think we could be looking at medication, and again, not a physician. So disclaimer warning, this is not medical advice. However, I think that we could be looking at medication as something that we could use if we had what we should have, which is publicly funded therapy available to go in combination.
So wait, this is what I want to be clear with you on. So when I break my leg and I go to Emerge, they don't diagnose me with a broken leg and then say, can you afford to have your leg repaired?
No.
So you're telling me that if I go to my doctor and what the doctor says is what you really need is counseling, that's a private service. That's not a publicly available service.
Exactly. Do you have insurance? Will probably be the question. Now, there's been some foray into therapy that we call cognitive behavioral therapy, which is an evidence-based therapy, because there's been a largely unregulated sector for history. It's for a long time, mental health care was sort of seen as la la land and not serious medicine. And so it's new that there's research on what treatments actually work and are based on evidence and what treatments are not. And so it's new. It was initiated under the former government to fund publicly funded therapy called cognitive behavioral therapy. And so it is available if you live in 4 geographies in Ontario currently. It has not been scaled up. And then there are new provincial programs that are online or on telephone programs that have been scaled up to support people through COVID-19. But none of this is building a system of care, going back to your hip analogy, where every family doctor knows what to do if you break your hip. Every physician in a hospital knows what to do if you break your hip. And they measure your wait time for service. They measure your outcomes, like, are you actually in less pain? Did your hip heal? How long did you need to convalesce for? That's all measured and reported back to providers. It's reported publicly on websites. And there's none of that in mental health and addiction. And for the burden, we talk about the burden of the disease in terms of how much healthcare resources it takes up, how many lives it cuts short. It's so inequitable, and I think always comes back to stigma and always comes back to the fact that the people that would benefit from that system work, they don't vote.
Right. Well, stigma, I mean, how can that ever go away? Like, I just know in my head that if I went to my employer and I said, I need time off because I'm an alcoholic, or I
Yeah,
need time off because I'm so depressed and stressed that I'm dysfunctional.
yeah.
That's a career limiting move for me. Like, I don't know what the reaction of my employer will be, but it means I'm unlikely to be the vice president when I come back.
I mean, I think personally, what people in positions like mine, like yours, do need to do to contribute to the reduction of stigma is be willing to talk about, like me just identifying for the first time that I take medication. I think that is reducing stigma, because people,
Right.
I think, look at me and don't assume, that's me. I had to take time off after, I've had to take time off at work, like a couple of weeks off at a time, when I was dealing with severe anxiety and depression. And I think those of us who are in positions and feel brave enough and are willing to be vulnerable about it and not risk our jobs need to talk about it. But that has risk. It has risk for me to just say what I did. And so really the onus is on employers. In the same way that it is in the area of childcare, in the same way that it is in the area of equity and anti-racism. Because if we don't tackle this, if we don't reduce the stigma, if we don't make it safe for you to say, I need to take time off because my alcohol, the amount of alcohol I'm using is out of control, then we're losing a good chunk of the workforce talent. 1 in 5 people have come into contact with a mental health challenge in their lifetime. So if we don't tackle
Right.
this, we're losing out on a tremendous part of the workforce.
Right. Can we talk about opioids for a second? Because I don't know anything about them, and I'm curious about them. Is this what is the source of this problem? Where did this problem come from? Is this from overprescription of opioids, or is it just such an addictive drug that when used appropriately, you inevitably become addicted? Or is this a symptom of deep social dislocation in our society? What's going on with the opioid crisis?
I mean, I think where I need to start there is that the number of deaths that we're experiencing from overdose, so over 16,000 deaths across Canada since January 2016, and the lack and the complete silence from all levels of government on putting in solutions that we know work, that could save lives, it's fucked. It's fucked. And I think it's Dr. Andrea Sereda from London that I'm gonna quote. But forgive me if I got it wrong. It might be Mary Lou Gagnon from Ottawa. Every harm reduction tool, and I'll explain what harm reduction means in a sec. Every harm reduction tool was illegal before it became a best practice. And we just need to have a huge scale up of what I call way more tools in the tool belts of saving lives in the, I call it an overdose crisis, because it's not just opioids. There's other drugs now too. So what's the root cause? I think that's a multifaceted answer. One of the main root causes, and we don't. So this is another thing that it's risky for me to say, because it risks further stigmatizing, and not everyone has this history. But one of the biggest root causes of addiction and substance use and drug use is trauma. So having experienced as a child neglect, childhood sexual abuse, some sort of physical abuse, or as an adult experiencing a rape. And we don't talk about that enough, because we don't want it to further the point you asked earlier, David, about isn't it someone's fault? Because if they did experience that thing, then can't they just pull up their bootstraps and get over it and soldier on? Because it's not just trauma, it's a mixture of trauma and DNA and genetics. And so people who are, there's a lot of people who were suffering before they started using opioids, heroin, fentanyl, prescription opioids, carfentanil now, that sought some immediate relief from what they were experiencing in their head, say PTSD, with using that substance. There was a period of time, so yes to overprescription. There was a period of time where there were way too many opioids overprescribed, and where prescription drug companies marketed a drug to family doctors of not being addictive that was absolutely addictive. And
are we talking about Oxy here?
Indeed we are.
Okay.
And family doctors.
So the pharma companies told family doctors that OxyContin was not addictive. Correct.
Okay, they were told that it was a pain reliever that would not be addictive. They turned out wrong. And then we went through a period of time where we actually, I would say, and harm reduction experts would say, too dramatically reduced how we were deprescribing people. So doctors got so scared that their practices were being monitored for how many prescriptions they were prescribing, that they too quickly took people off prescription opioids. Where did those people go? They went to get drugs from a drug dealer on the street. Then their addiction went from Oxy to fentanyl, because that's cheaper. That's much cheaper for drug dealers to cut either heroin or Oxy with fentanyl in the supply. Fentanyl has a different high than heroin, than Oxy. So then people started seeking, which is apparently a much, I'm not speaking from personal experience. Maybe I could be. Apparently the high of heroin is a lower euphoria and longer lasting, and fentanyl is a much higher euphoria and shorter lasting. So what happens if the high is...
It's the crack of heroin.
I guess. Maybe you speak from experience, David. Yeah, and so it's, when we think of, this is why I get so frustrated talking about the opioid crisis, because people talk about it like it's something we can't solve, and actually there's really specific things and decisions happened that have exacerbated the problem. And then with COVID-19, our borders were shut, and people's drug supply has completely changed. So what they're injecting, what they're inhaling, what they're snorting is different chemicals in the same quantity that they think they know how to use without killing themselves. So overdose deaths, opioid deaths, have risen between 35 to 40% over the course of the pandemic. And in 3/4 of those cases, people were alone when they died. So harm reduction is all about, let's not try to assume that everyone is going to be able to live a life of abstinence from whatever their vice is. So let's build up strategies to allow them to safely use that substance. Sometimes that's about reducing the amount of substance drug they're using on a regular basis, but sometimes it's about, all we're going to do is keep you alive when you're using that drug. So you're going to be really near a naloxone kit. You're going to be near people who can do CPR. We're going to give you a clean needle so you're not at risk of contracting hepatitis or AIDS. We're going to give you a spoon, and we're going to give you clean water so that you can prepare that for injection. And that is what an overdose prevention site is. And across Canada, governments are largely either not expanding these sites or they're shutting them down. Those are the sites, those are the services that need to be available so that people who are using drugs, as I said earlier, not to be sick every day, need to be able to use so that they stay alive. And I hear the criticism a lot. Well, that's just giving a person one more day to survive, because the next day they're going to inject, and that is not a life that should be protected anyways. Isn't that person going to die eventually? Well, I don't think that's the point. First of all, I don't think we'd look at any other illness and say, if someone chose to keep living, like let's say I had terminal cancer and a doctor said to me, there's this new chemotherapy drug that we're going to give you access to. We don't think it's likely not going to save your life, but it might extend your life by another 3 months. If I chose to take that, no one would be questioning the value of those last 3 months of my life. No one, right? And the other thing that these overdose prevention sites do is, for the first time, they provide a space where people are not having to use drugs in fear of being arrested. So I spoke to a man when I visited the Moss Park site again. I talked with a man. He was a Black man. I think that we always need to acknowledge, when we're talking about the criminalization of drugs and addiction, that we're acknowledging the overwhelming weight of the criminalization lies on the shoulder of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And he told me that he had started to experience paranoia because, to the point where it was a mental illness, because of his drug use constantly. Every time that he was injecting or inhaling his drug, he was needing to do so in the shadows, hiding from police. And so he was constantly looking over his shoulders. And he said that coming and using the service for the first time, he did not feel like he had paranoia for the first time in, I think he said, 20 years. And that he was starting to think about steps he could take to reduce the amount of drugs he was using on a daily basis. So whenever anybody says, well, overdose prevention sites shouldn't be allowed because that's just allowing people to continue with this behavior we think is really judgmental, I call bullshit on that, because we wouldn't say that about any other chronic health condition. And at the same time, it's also achieving the goal of providing health and social services to a population who gets arrested, who gets turned away at hospitals, and who can't access a family doctor largely.
Okay. Adrienne, time is flying by, but I have one last really important question, or a question that's important to me, which is whether it's marijuana or whether it's alcohol or whether it's antidepressants or whether it's opioids, it's evident that millions and millions of us are medicating ourselves to deal with some mental pain of some kind.
Yeah.
Where is all that unhappiness coming from? Is that a human condition that we're medicating our way out of? Is it something that's unique to our society and the way we've structured it, that people are unhappy? What are we all medicating against?
I do think that as society, we have gotten a lot. Well, I can't speak to how my mom grew up or my dad grew up, but it seems to me we really are uncomfortable with grief and with trauma, and my mom came from a super, super waspy, repressed family. And I think that when you are suffering and which all of us do, it's a human condition. We lose loved ones. We go through divorce. We lose jobs. We lose elections. Grieving is a human condition, and I think that I'm speaking very personally, so for those of us of the white Anglo-Saxon background, we've been long told and have it in our genetics to repress those emotions and repress those feelings. And yet, as the world is evolving, and I think, frankly, as there's more women in leadership positions, we're starting to see that we need to tap into these emotions. But I think it's uncomfortable. I think it's really, really uncomfortable. And I think that we are suffering as a people of a lack of being willing to be comfortable with discomfort and sitting in discomfort. And I think that substances tend to, or video games or whatever the vice is, gambling, they're a really good distraction for the mind to not have to sit in discomfort for a certain period of time. We're lonely, but we're also overstimulated. And I think, again, in answering that question, I need to say that human social condition is different from the fact that people are dying because they can't access healthcare services. They're connected for sure. There's some connection there, but it's not the same, because the more, like something that I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around in COVID is a lot of people are talking all of a sudden about the mental health of certain populations, which is great. But don't virtue signal to the mental health of certain populations if we're not funding services that we know will save people's lives, who we know are dying. And so I think it's important to note that distinction.
The distinction between the broad issue of mental health in our society and the critical acute situation that some people find themselves in. That's the distinction you're talking about.
Exactly. Because if we don't, right now, governments have tended to want to make investments in areas that support the broader population rather than make investments in people who are critically ill with a mental health or addiction condition. And unless we start looking at as a chronic disease, like cancer, like cardiac, where you say, oh man, that person's at risk of life, we got to wrap services around them, then we're just going to keep investing in what works at the door.
Right. Adrienne, thank you. This could go on for a long time, obviously, but perhaps we can resume it at some point. Thank you for doing this. It was great to see you again.
Great to see you too. Thank you.
Yeah.
Virtually. See you COVID style.
Exactly. Exactly. When we think of Canada and space missions, what's the first thing that comes to mind? For a lot of you, I'm betting it's the Canadarm. Remember the photos? That red maple leaf against that vast sea of blackness? Well, there's a hell of a lot more to the story. It starts in 1969 with a wholly owned Canadian company called MacDonald, Detweiler and Associates, now known as MDA. Theirs has a 51-year history as an international space mission partner and a robotics, satellite systems, and geointelligence pioneer. Like any leader, it's a story of firsts. Canada is the first country with a domestic communication satellite in orbit because of MDA's contributions. They beat NASA engineers in the race to process the first image from CSAT, the world's first radar remote sensing satellite. The Hubble Space Telescope? Canadarm deployed it. MDA launched the world's first commercially focused radar satellite. They built a meteorological station on Mars. Invented Dexter, a dual-armed robot for the International Space Station. And MDA has just been tapped for a third-generation Canadarm for a lunar orbiting space station. I just cherry-picked a few of over 50 firsts. Now they're leading the charge toward viable moon colonies, enhanced Earth observation, and communication in a hyper-connected world. MDA isn't just Canada's largest space technology developer and manufacturer. They grow our economy, and they advocate for an entire industry. A space company with a big Canadian flag on their backpack. You can find out more about them at mda.space. Hey, it's Tuesday and we're back. Jenny,
Hi.
Scott, how are you?
Good. How are
Good to see
you?
you.
Yeah, good to see you too, David.
Excellent. It's winter here. There's a foot of snow on the ground and it's not going anywhere. I had to bring out the snowblower yesterday.
Oh no.
It's winter here. It's winter
Yeah.
in Toronto this week. We had 19.4 centimeters at the airport. I know that because I looked it up the other night, got into argument with somebody about how much snow we'd had. This is how I know
Well,
I'm
but it's
over
gone
50.
already.
I talk about the weather reports and argue about the exact amount of snowfall. Well, I don't know. It felt more like 19 to me.
All right. So, we put out a broad appeal this week because when we met to talk about our pod, we said, COVID, what is there to fucking say about COVID that we haven't said? And Trump, what is there to say about Trump that we haven't said? So we have mailbag questions this week. Hopefully Canadian politics will get lively enough that we can talk about Canadian politics again. But in the meantime, we'll dig into the mailbag. So let's start here. Where are we going to start? We will start with Darcy W., who says, I am wondering if you have any advice for a person who's left one political party and is trying to successfully integrate into a new party after a time of neutrality. And this person is particularly interested in Jenny Byrne's input because she was part of the Reform Party. So, is there somebody who's executed this in a principled and strategic way? Switching parties. Jenny?
Well, I just want to say, I don't know why it's directed at me. I've actually never switched parties. My party's just turned into different ones.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
I was a reformer first, never was a member of the PC party. Then we became the Canadian Alliance, and then we became the Conservative Party. So I have not actually, Darcy switched switched party.
No, Darcy, let's clarify this. It's been a series of hostile takeovers.
That's right. I've always been on Team Rec Canada and never switched.
Oh. Fuck you, Reed.
Oh, come on.
I'm not going to talk about whether a principle with floor crossers, but successful ones, I guess, in kind of this generation. Scott Bryson did it well. He seemed to switch over and integrate very well into your party. You've had someone like Thomas Mulcair, who seemingly, I think, federally before he became an NDP MP, I think he flirted on the edge with all the parties. I know he did with ours at the time. So I think that the most recent for our party was Leona Elsalav that crossed from the Liberals to our party. I don't think it was probably the most fun experience for her, based on when she was appointed deputy leader by Andrew last year, because of course I said at the time he kind of over promoted her for someone that had just been a party member for less than a year. So I think that it happens in politics. I think we probably see it what happened once every parliament, and it is what it is.
Shouldn't be understated, though, how difficult a thing it is to do. First of all, on a personal level, having talked to people who've both done it and people who contemplated doing it, you have to contemplate leaving all of your social circle behind. So you are making a decision to literally split off from the life you've led and the life you've had and move forward with a different group of people. And the odds are that you're never going to be truly accepted in your new home. The odds are that you're always going to be a little bit of a stranger. You don't have the family history. You're a little bit suspect. And certainly that was the case with Mulcair, as Mulcair was never fully accepted into the NDP, even though they allowed him to lead it. You could tell by their reaction to his defeat that he'd never been fully accepted into the thing. It's a very, very difficult thing to do. And I think Scott was in a unique circumstance, because Scott was able to argue both publicly and to himself that the party he had belonged to no longer existed. So he wasn't leaving a party to join another. His party had dissolved, and he was now choosing which of the things best suited him. But most people don't have that. Most people don't have that justification, and for most people, it's the end of their careers. The first one I was sort of witness to was Jack Horner out in Alberta back in the 70s. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I forgot the most famous floor crosser in the last 20 years, when you guys got Belinda to come over and prop you up for the vote in the spring of 2005.
Well, let me carry on with that then. I've told the story on the podcast before about, how that came about, and it was a moment of sincere, genuine, holy smokes, when she stepped out of the car and went into the National Press Theater, and the media, one of the few times we're actually able to contain a secret, and the media did not know what was going on. And when she got out of that car, jaws hit the ground, and you could hear the holy fuck of the entire national media. But the one thing I want to reinforce a couple of things that David said, because I think they're really true. I think the people that I've known that have made this decision, and there aren't a ton that I know very well. Scott Bryson's one of them. Belinda's another. I think that it's the people that agonize over the decision and that have difficulty with the decision that are most likely to be accepted by the place to which they go. And maybe even most likely to be accepted by the public, because it is by definition the opposite, right? It's the clear opportunists who don't even struggle with it. They just kind of go, I think I smell an opportunity here that people, because, world hates opportunists. So I think that, on the Belinda thing, I won't repeat the whole story, but I will reinforce one thing, because I know that, people look back on it with a lot of cynicism. She was greeted with a lot of cynicism at the time. But I am telling you, as one human being who stood in a room and watched her as she was going through with that decision, it ripped her guts out. Like, when we met the morning that she was going to go to the National Press Theater, she had spent the entire evening arguing with her then boyfriend, Peter MacKay, after he told her, I don't think she got a wink of sleep. He was like, okay, our relationship is over. I can't believe you did this. I mean, you can imagine his sense of personal betrayal, her sense of disappointment that he wouldn't support her on a personal basis. Like, it was heartrending. It was gut churning. It was deeply personal. And she was white as cigarette ash. Like, her hands were trembling. Like, it was It was a traumatizing experience. It genuinely was. And so I think that I have some respect for the people that find it a hard thing to do, because the people that find it an easy thing to do are probably the people that are doing it for the wrong reasons. And I agree with David, and I'm sorry, and people are going to hate this, but we are by definition partisans. And I'll tell you something, like there are some exceptions, but you're not going to get trusted. You're not going to get trusted by the new team. You're never going to be seen as fully, because politics is a team sport. And you're always going to be thinking, well, if he or she bailed on their last team, maybe he or she will bail on our team. And maybe that's too tribal. Maybe people will say that's, evidence of what's wrong in politics and our system. But, I think we often undervalue the importance of loyalty, of having to take a punch in the jaw, even when it makes you look bad because you're part of a team and you have to suffer the slings and arrows along with the celebration. So I would really underscore that.
No, I think I agree totally with both you guys. And actually, when you talk about the opportunist category of people, I remember also Gurmont Greywall, Gurmont and Nina, the first husband and wife duo elected, approached you guys and taped all these conversations. And I have 3 days of my life, a full long weekend that I will never get back, listening to tapes of Gurmont Greywall and Nina having conversations in Punjabi, where we would hold up a telephone to one of our staffers that spoke Punjabi to transcribe it, as well as Tim Murphy, and figuring out exactly, because Gurmont taped all of these conversations, and somehow we ended up getting the tapes.
And just to clarify, Tim wasn't speaking Punjabi.
Warm
he was speaking ass on fire.
Yeah. Warm, comfy rug. I remember, Tim, the morning of the Belinda thing, I was with John Webster, and he was co-chairing our campaign with me, and Tim called and said that Belinda had cold feet. She had cold feet, and John Webster said to Tim, "Rub them."
We'll halt the story right there.
Okay. There you go, Darcy. There's that question for you. Don M. wants to know, is the internal polling conducted by political parties typically better than what we are provided, especially in the U.S.? It just seems like the parties are more in tune with their polling. And he cites Wisconsin in the States as an example.
David, you're the
Jenny,
pollster on the panel. You start. You're the
go
pollster
first,
on the
Dave.
panel. You start.
All right, I'll start. Well, I mean, yes, the answer is yes, that the political parties have much, much better information than is publicly available. First of all, they're generating and consuming and analyzing a lot more data. So if you're in the public, you are occasionally seeing a poll that is done by a media organization or for a media organization by a polling company. But when we were doing the national campaigns in 2004, 2006, we were surveying 1,000 people a night. And so we had a ton of data to look at and understand ridings by, understand regions by, understand demographics by. And most importantly, that you don't get out of the public polling is detailed questionnaires that don't just tell you who's ahead and who's gaining or falling behind, but why that's happening. What is moving votes? What is happening out there? What are people hearing out of all the noise that is actually changing minds and moving opinions? So in my experience, yes, the political parties have vastly better, more reliable, and more predictive information from polling than the general public does through media polls. Either of you have a different take on that?
Yeah, no, I agree wholeheartedly. And to your point about hearing what is happening on the ground, I think I've said this before. I think leading into the last election, is that I always found in talking to candidates and our people on the ground, we were always a few days ahead. We were getting the information from them. We're always a few days ahead. Like when you guys ran the polls with Harper and Brian Mulroney in the 2004 election, and Mike Harris, it was an automatic recoil on the doors, especially with Harris. And we were hearing that. I was going to the Grand Poobahs in 2004, and they were like, "There's no change in our polling." And then 3 or 4 days later, there was a change in our polling. because it was starting to hurt. And if you look at it's both in 15 and 19. The NDP were seen as higher, especially in the early to midpoint of the campaign, because they had such a disproportionate amount of support at that time in Quebec, and that you were seeing that with Scheer in the prairies. And I know that pollsters wait and what have you, but there had to have been some factor in that because those numbers were misleading. And so what we have done, both provincially and federally in the last campaigns that I've been involved in, is we do national polling, but for the most part, we're polling regions, or we're doing riding polling. And I know I've mentioned her before, Brooke Piggott. She is still my go-to if I want to decipher what's going on in different numbers, because she's brilliant. It's better for us, especially when our vote is not it is more beneficial for us to poll in certain regions of the 905 than to add safe seats into it, like my home riding of Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes, Brock. And for the most part, I'm not like throwing it away and taking anything for granted. For years, we don't need to poll in Saskatchewan and Alberta. That would be a waste of money because we somewhat know where we stand in those areas.
So I think
it's sometimes very important. Sometimes very important, Jenny, to know whether you're at 63 or 67%.
Exactly.
I think that's really interesting, and making reference to the fact that you say, well, we're placing a lot more emphasis on certain ridings, placing a lot more emphasis on regional, and the reason I think that's interesting is more a question for David. I wonder if sometimes that can also mask things that you need to know. So, for an example, in 2014, and this may be, I don't know, you guys can tell me, this may be too long ago for an intelligent discussion of polling. But in 2014, when Tim Hudak lost and Kathleen Wynne won, folks running Hudak's campaign, they thought that he was winning, right? They thought that the numbers were good. And when I talked to them, I wondered if methodology and this particular difference in the party. So, I
wasn't involved. Like that. That's
no.
Two totally different
It was a similar thing. I'm not blaming you. I'm saying, but I thought it was interesting because I don't think that they were wrong. I just think that maybe they were too in depth on sampling certain swing ridings. So they told me that basically their methodology in terms of tracking wasn't to do what David was doing, which was to take a whole province or take the country, and then, and you might overweight here and there, and David can explain it more thoughtfully than I can. But rather, they were relying on their sampling overall was just of a bundle, if you will, a batch of swing ridings. And because that maybe wasn't as representative of the entire province, they missed things. And as a consequence, their polling was right. It just wasn't comprehensive enough I wonder if that's emerged.
Well, I made a terrible mistake.
I can't speak to that. I'm saying the campaigns that I've been part of obviously didn't make those mistakes, because we were pretty accurate, because it was able to show us where we could move resources, where we needed help, where we could shift resources, where we can shift resources from.
But didn't they do the same thing?
I made a terrible mistake in 2004, which was the first election I was doing the polling in, and I was persuaded at the start that rather than polling nationally, we should be polling in in swing ridings. And so we had identified some swing ridings that we assumed we would carry, and then some stretch ridings that we hoped we would carry, and our polling was concentrated in those. And then right off the bat, the Conservatives took it to us so hard, and our support collapsed so badly that we were losing all of our swing ridings. And I had no idea what was going on in the country. Like, I didn't have any, I then didn't know where we were at. All I knew was we weren't winning any of the ridings we needed to win, but I didn't know how deep that rot had gone. So I had to junk that whole system and go quickly to a national sample. And that's what I've done ever since, is a national sample or a provincial sample with some over samples in key areas, but then applying that to a seat projection model, which guides our regional efforts. I'll never make that swing riding mistake again.
Could I ask you another question, David? Because I was listening to a podcast today about the U.S. election and why the U.S. pollsters were off in 2020 with Trump. And And they were making a couple of arguments, most of which centered around Trump himself, where they said, well, if you take a look at the polling, even by the same outfits on a gubernatorial basis or on a congressional basis and stuff, those polls didn't appear to be terribly off. But when it came to the presidential race, they were off. And one of the things that was being speculated was that there are large portions, not so much the I'm ashamed to admit that social bias thing that people talk about. I'm ashamed to admit that I'm a Trump supporter. It wasn't so much that. They're saying that penetration rates with Trump voters were extraordinarily difficult to get to, because you would get 12 seconds into an interview and identify yourself, and a Trump supporter, because of their distrust of media, institutions, the establishment, so to speak, would identify the pollster as part of that establishment and would get like 10, 15 seconds in and they would go, fuck off, and they would hang up. And so they were saying it's harder and harder and harder to penetrate, to get a sample that you can say to yourself is statistically reliable, that includes that mindset. And I wonder if that, I mean, Trump will, presumably he'll fade, but will it persist past him? Do you think that's right? What I was just hearing that?
Well, first of all, a person as literate as you should be saying more and more difficult instead of harder and harder and harder. But
more harder. It's more harder. This is our getting.
Just leaving that aside, I thought I'd help you with that. But I think that's the most persuasive theory about why the American polls were off. I mean, obviously, there's going to be a deep dive into what went wrong, and we'll learn more. But at the moment, I find the most persuasive argument that the United States is so polarized that people have an immediate sense of what side of that divide you're on just by the way you talk about an issue, think about an issue, frame a question. So
I can tell it's a Democratic pollster. Or
it's not. Yeah, they're not about me. They're not trying to explain me. This is not for me. And so, I don't think it's a Trump phenomenon. I think it's an alienated from the establishment people phenomenon. I think it's probably exists in Canada, although less pronounced. And so, I'm personally taking it as an early wake-up call, and I'm going to be looking at ways of ensuring that questionnaires that I draft with my own innate biases do not betray that bias to.
Right. So you don't start by asking people about their experiences at the graduate pub.
Exactly. Exactly. All right. We got another one here. This one is fun, I think. What is your... Travis S. says, my fantasy historical PM election matchup would be an 84 Mulroney versus 93 Chrétien. What would yours be?
Scott, you go ahead. I know you want to answer this one.
Okay, so I'm nerding out because...
Wait a second. Hold that question. It's such a good question. Hold it, because we've got to take a break for our sponsor.
Cool bastard.
I think pretty much everybody can agree that aside from a vaccine, there's nothing more important than getting the economic recovery right. There's been some serious damage. Governments have taken on huge debts trying to contain it. Entire industries are teetering, and lots of Canadians who don't have job security or the ability to work from home are barely hanging on. So there's a lot of talk of rebuilding. The federal government needs help. It is committed to backing investment in major projects, and its infrastructure bank is out there actively soliciting private money to pay for really big jobs. Well, CN is raising its hand. The railroad wants to build a critical piece of infrastructure, a new terminal for transfer of cargo from trains to trucks in Milton, south of Toronto. That area is the fastest growing market in the country, and CN is trying to meet its demand for freight. Trains are now stopping in Montreal and sending cargo down the highway to Toronto in thousands of trucks. And trucks are neither as efficient nor as climate friendly as trains. The Milton project is vital. CN has bought the land, and the environmental impact reviews took years to complete. But approval is political. It is now before Cabinet in Ottawa. CN's not asking for any help from taxpayers. It's willing to spend $250 million of its own money, and the Milton project will be the most environmentally advanced rail hub in North America. The government says it wants to build back better. So does CN. Let's get on with the job. And we're back. All right, Scott, what is your great PM matchup head to head?
So I like to play this game because I'm a pure nerd. I'm a comic book nerd and a political nerd. As you can see behind me, bookshelf is riddled with comics and books about politics. And one of my favorite comics of all time, Marvel Comics, What If? So what if Gwen Stacy had lived and she hadn't died in the arms of Spider-Man? And let me tell you, the whole Spider-Verse would have unfolded differently. I love playing that. I love playing that same game in Canadian politics. And to me, the great what if, resulting in an election that didn't occur, similar to this question, is what if Mulroney had won the 76 Conservative leadership? Like, I think that's a fascinating, parallel universe sliding doors moment, because if he had won 76, Brian Mulroney would instantly have been more appealing in the province of Quebec than Clark was, obviously, as leader. I think in 1979, it means that Pierre Trudeau remains retired. He doesn't come out of retirement. He doesn't, we don't see, he exit the stage. And I think you would have ended up with an election where you would have had, Mulroney versus Trudeau in 1978 or 79. You would have not had a Trudeau comeback. You would have not had a national energy program. You would have possibly not had a Canada Health Act. You would
How about the charter?
You would not have had the charter. Not obvious that he would have pursued the charter, particularly because he probably would have won in the same coalition as he managed to put together in '84 with Péquis. I think he almost certainly would have won a majority because he would have won enough seats that Clark couldn't in the province of Quebec that would have given him that control. So I think the great what if is a 78 election between Trudeau and Mulroney, where Mulroney probably wins, almost certainly wins, and wins a majority, and a whole bunch of staples that we think of as elements of modern Canadian political life, national energy program, the charter, all those kinds of none of that happens. And I don't know what would have happened. I don't know what.
Well, there's even one more implication. There's even one more implication. 80-84 made Jean Chrétien who he was.
That's
Being
right.
Justice Minister between 80-84 made Chrétien who he was. So it's not obvious that if 80-84 Trudeau government doesn't happen and there's a Liberal leadership that opens up in the mid-70s, it's not obvious that Chrétien wins it.
Well, Mr. Turner
He's
wouldn't
not Jean
come back.
Chrétien at that point.
I don't think Turner would have been the leader in 1979, right?
No, he would have been Donald MacDonald.
Yeah, so Donald MacDonald becomes the leader. He probably gets beat, let's say, in one election. Who knows? Maybe he wins the second. But as you say, Turner and Chrétien don't exist necessarily as leaders. I love this shit. I love this stuff.
It's like a choose your own adventure for like.
It is. Oh my goodness! I pulled the gem from the dragon's mouth, and now I get to go to Hobbit World.
So
Jenny, what matchup would you have loved to see?
I wasn't so much thinking this wouldn't have changed history, but if you're talking about two people I would be interested to see go against each other are Pierre Trudeau and Stephen Harper. They're both actually seen, I think, as very very similar. They're extremely intelligent. They're seen as aloof, very policy oriented. I think probably I had the same. The perceived aloofness of Pierre Trudeau is probably what that conservatives saw. Probably was what liberals saw with Harper. He was extremely polarizing figure that you guys didn't like, and obviously Pierre Trudeau was not liked by Tories. So I think it'd be a fascinating matchup to see two people who are with obviously very different ideologies, but very similar, seemingly personalities and skill set.
Yeah. So I think the two best athletes I ever saw were Trudeau and Mulroney. And so I would be fascinated to watch an election campaign between the 1974 version of Pierre Trudeau and the 1988 version of Brian Mulroney. At their best, each of them at their peak as a campaigner, Trudeau with a compelling social vision of Canada, Mulroney with a compelling economic vision of Canada, one of them a retail grassroots politician, the other one a cerebral politician. both of them capable of generating very, very strong emotions on both sides. I think that would have been fascinating to watch, and I think they were the two best campaigners I saw in my lifetime.
By the way, I think the question poses the idea of Chrétien and Mulroney against one another, and I'll just add, Mr. Mulroney once told me, he said, all the a lot of this kind of thing that I'm just doing, it's all horseshit, right? Like he literally said, that's all bullshit. He said, look, when I was running, right, I had the great, obvious, huge advantage that all politicians want, which was that it was time for a change. And my great distinguishing feature was that I was not Pierre Trudeau. And when Chrétien was running, his great, huge advantage was that he was not Brian Mulroney. And that's the fucking truth of it. And that's why he won a big majority in 93. It's why I won a big majority in 84. It's why Turner didn't win. And so, he really, in talking about this, he really emphasized, the obvious point that we all know, which is that, it isn't just the quality of the leadership, it's also cycles. I think, obviously he is a great pure athlete, though. Mulroney, when Mulroney's in full flight, he was something to watch.
Yeah, for sure. Lonely Goat, number 5. Lonely Goat 5.
I know her. We have an
Lonely
active
Goat
correspondence.
5 asked, Before she met you, she was just Goat 5.
I make them all lonely.
Appointing subject matter experts to cabinet roles, whether they are or are not elected members of Parliament, good or bad idea? Scott.
It's entirely circumstantial. It's particularly.
Wait a second. In what circumstance is it a good idea?
Huh? In what circumstance is it not a good idea?
Is it a good idea?
Well, no, there have been a moment.
No, in what circumstance is it a good idea to put somebody not elected into the cabinet?
Well, there've really only been 2 occasions when it worked, right? The 3 wise men, and then after the 95 referendum when Pettigrew and Dion came in, and. My perspective is, particularly it's not the same thing as it was in 1965. You can't get away with that now, like Pearson did, in the sense that I don't think people's tolerance for an unelected cabinet member is pretty low. But I think there's 2 pieces to this question that need to be broken down. One is appointing somebody to cabinet, trying to bring them in and give energy. I can see moments like that, and I can see circumstances being recreated where it might make sense for a sitting prime minister to do that, like Pearson did or like Chrétien did. So I can see that occurring. The subject matter expert thing, I'm a little more leery of. Like, I've never necessarily been a big fan of saying, oh, well, we've got to talk about healthcare, so let's go get a doctor to be our cabinet minister. Like, I don't think that's the way the world works. I think you say, let's go get the best athlete on the board, draft that person, and then we'll build around their talent. So, if you're in a situation where you really need to rejuvenate yourself, bringing somebody in from the outside, putting them in and saying, we'll put them in the next general or the next by-election, whichever comes first, I can see that working. But you're taking on a heavy burden. And I wouldn't pick somebody, to be the justice minister because they happen to be the best crown attorney in the country. That's not how politics works, in my view.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I think it sometimes works. I think it sometimes doesn't. I think 2 examples. One for us, we appointed Gordon O'Connor in 2006 as defense minister, and just because of the internal military politics, it did not work out as well for Gordon, even though he was a 3-star general and had obviously commanded troops. It didn't work out the same way as Bill Morneau had a big reputation for financial prowess on Bay Street and turned out to be an absolute abysmal finance minister for the first 5 years for Trudeau. There are some cases where it works. You've got, especially ministries like agriculture. Jerry Ritz was a farmer who ended up being a good ag minister. Wayne Easter on your side, he had an agricultural background. So I think
Van Cleve from Prince Edward County.
Yeah, I think that it really depends on who the person is and what the ministry is, because either you're good at it or you're not. And I think it may speak to whether someone's good politician or not. And I think Trudeau, is probably, if you see, you would look at it, I'm assuming that Stephen Guilbeault probably would have been chomping at the bit and requesting to be environment minister, and Trudeau and his team obviously put him elsewhere. I think he's causing a lot of headaches for them in that regard. But I think that it's important that it's someone that is a subject expert going in, has so many preconceived notions and biases that it's very hard for them in cases to kind of get their head wrapped to get out of that because they are so preconceived. So whether it's the government agenda or whether it's the minutia or the issues that the bureaucrats are trying to get past you, it becomes very hard if you just if you have those preconceived notions going in.
For sure. It's much more important to be good at politics than to be a subject matter expert.
Agreed.
To be a good cabinet minister. And I don't just mean a successful cabinet minister politically, but actually be a good cabinet minister. Get things done, accomplish things, move them forward. It really needs political judgment and political skill more than it needs subject matter expertise. I've totally changed my opinion on appointing outsiders to the cabinet. As a young person, when Turner became the prime minister, I was very much a proponent of an idea that he should have appointed people that intended to run for the party in the upcoming election from Western Canada into his cabinet so that Westerners could see what kind of cabinet he wanted to have, what kind of government he wanted to have. But over time, you don't have any credibility if you're not elected. I mean, being appointed to the cabinet without a seat, you're not really a cabinet minister. You don't really have that credibility, and it strikes people as illegitimate. And it's probably not the beginning of your political career, but the end of it, to have been appointed right into cabinet. I presume that the government of Mark Carney faced this decision this fall when they were talking about what his role was going to be. That might be somebody people would say, well, why don't you just take him and put him in the cabinet? I don't think our system works that way.
Yeah. Immediately in today's politics, you're going to be stamped with the seal of presumption. So then you were going to begin two steps behind. You're going to have to overcome that characterization and show that you're not actually presuming on anything. But, we are skipping over the obvious, and we kind of implicitly addressed it. The most obvious and most there's one commanding exception to all of this, right? Somebody appointed to cabinet, somebody who was a subject matter expert and was brought in for those purposes and took the portfolio, you would have thought, from their subject matter expertise, and it's Pierre Trudeau, right? Pierre Trudeau brought in, right? Put in. He was an elected member. He was an elected member of Parliament. He was brought in as an outsider first.
No. Trudeau, in fact, Pearson made him have a stint as parliamentary secretary before he even got into cabinet.
Sorry, you're right. Yeah. I'm sorry. All right, well then, forget it.
The better example is Trudeau tried to do this a number of times, and he tried to do it with a guy named Pierre Junot. And nobody has ever heard of Pierre Junot anymore, except for the Juno Awards are named after him. This is the most Canadian thing ever, that we name our music awards after a bureaucrat. But Pierre Junot was a heritage bureaucrat who Trudeau twice tried to get into the cabinet, and appointed him to the cabinet and had him run in by-elections. And he lost both by-elections.
Okay, now I think it's my turn to correct you. I don't think the Juno Awards are named after Pierre Junot. I think they're named after Juno, as in Roman mythology.
$1,000.
Okay. All right.
$1,000.
As you know, Jenny's good for it.
Yeah. They're named after Pierre Junot.
It's not Junot.
Can you believe that?
It's Juno. We got to figure this out. All right.
You guys talk away. I'm getting on the Google.
The Google won't know. Google's English.
All right. We got one. Do we have time for one last one here? Yeah, we got to get a quick one in here because we got
Scott, that $1,000 I gave you, you're going to have to send to David, because the Juno Awards website, named in tribute to Pierre Junot, the first chairperson of the Canadian Radio, Television, and Telecommunications Commission.
All right. I'm thinking of the Gemini Awards. Gemini. Astrology. It's the Taurus. The Taurus trophy.
John W. says, for Jenny and the panel, I noticed that a lot of these questions are directed specifically to Jenny, and some people may toss in Reed and Herle, if you want to comment, go
We
ahead.
got no following, man. We got no fans.
For Jenny and the panel, in 2011, the Harper Conservatives ran a very successful negative ad campaign against Michael Ignatieff. The "Have you met Michael?" Oh no, the "He didn't come back for you" ads. If you were advising the Ontario Liberals, which is not inconceivable, if you were advising the Ontario Liberals, what is the equivalent "He didn't come back for you" sticky ad against Doug Ford?
Well, I think the best part of, and I like to call them contrast ads, and it's not that we were the only ones to have them. I think you guys did them pretty well.
First ever. You were first and worst.
Yeah.
Is terrible.
I think if a good negative or contrast ad has to have some truth to it for it to be effective. And so in terms of the you can go to the Stéphane Dion ads in 2008. Do you think it's easy to make priorities? Well, it fit because obviously Dion was all over the map. He had really no platform. He had like no vision. He had no concrete policies except for the carbon tax. In 2011, He didn't come back for you. Turned out it was true because, as we've talked about on this pod before, it was within days of the election where basically Iggy's like, yeah, so I'm a peace out Canada. I'm heading back to Harvard. And so they have to have some truth to it. So I guess if you're the Liberals or if you're anyone looking at going after a sitting government, you're looking at what is going to hurt the government more, the voters that switch in Ontario, mostly between the Liberals and the Conservatives. And I think that probably COVID and COVID management is going to end up giving all opposition parties. Del Duca and Horwath would fall into that category, probably fodder in terms of ads. And so by the time the next Ontario election rolls around, it's another just shy of it's going to be the spring of 2022. So just shy of 2 years from now. There's probably going to be, as we've talked about, the economic consequences of COVID. We're seeing it now and I know we wanted to keep this a COVID-free pod, but we're seeing it now even in the last few days here in Toronto with business, somewhat of a revolt of business owners in terms of the lockdown that is happening in Peel and in Toronto. So I think that for opposition parties across the country, regardless of who they are, I think that the last 8 months and going forward have probably opened a lot of opportunities for in terms of negative advertising.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I would swift boat him. I'd go right at, swift boating means Karl Rove said, what is John Kerry's greatest strength? It's his military service. And I'm going to break the back of that. I'm going to crack that and he'll have nothing. Ford has this, and COVID has reinforced it. Ford has this folksy, one of the people, average guy, I'm in it for average people persona. And yet he consistently favors the interests of business over ordinary people. Every decision he makes does that. And I would go right at that, and I would crack that relationship of him being an ordinary guy representing ordinary people, and I'd push him on the side of business.
I agree with that, and I agree that we will know more about what the most effective entry point to that criticism, and therefore what the best, most potent, memorable ad to strip him hard would be once we see more about how COVID unfolds, because it will be the connection between those things, how regular folks were fed us a diet of, come on, friends, but got something else, and it's going to be in that context. I'll just add this quickly, which is that it's much harder to do what this question posits, though, than the examples that it cited. So, Ignatieff was defined as a political entity before he established himself, and he failed to define himself. And people were screaming, saying, you should be defining yourself. Get out there and do it. Run ads, define yourself, take some policy actions that do it. None of that was listened to. Conservatives filled the void. And as Jenny said, they filled the void with something that was so bullseye insightful about what people detected from that guy. that he could never shake it. And he couldn't shake it because it was fucking true, right? And so, just as you're saying, David, the secret to the sauce you're peddling is that it is true, and that's the key. But to do it to an incumbent who's already established, I think is harder than it is to somebody that's a whiteboard. Ford isn't a whiteboard, so you're going to have to work with what you got as opposed to imagining all things.
Okay. All right, it's time as we run down the clock. It's time for our new section, Hey You, where we blast out a question into the void to somebody in public life that we're curious about, and they maybe answer us and maybe don't. Scott, Hey You.
All right, so my Hey You is to Candice Bergen, your pal there, Jenny, and Conservative MP. Last week, we find out that Andrew Scheer, as Speaker, and another one of his super politically sharp moves that he managed to keep secret for years, had hired his sister, then hired his wife, and blah, 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 and all this stuff, and cozy insider bullshit thing. And O'Toole, I think, wisely
You gotta give this guy credit. He does not leave $1 on the table.
Not $1, right? The insurance broker, American political wannabe prime minister, also had his sister and mother and wife, and I don't know, whoever in hell hired. And, I'm not even going to waste the Hey You on Scheer because he is what he is. But O'Toole comes out and correctly calculates, I must be condemning of this, and I must be seen to be condemning of this, because the entire conservative critique of the Trudeau government is cozy insider, it's not what you know, it's who you know, and all that sort of stuff. And you can't peddle that line if you're also vulnerable to it and demonstrating that you're vulnerable to it. Candice Bergen is the deputy leader of the party, who I don't agree with about much, but I've always thought seemed like she was politically astute, comes out and basically condones it, contradicting O'Toole, or at least undermining O'Toole, competing with O'Toole, and seeming to give a pass to Scheer. And I just thought that was strange. So, hey, you, what the hell are you thinking, Bergen? This is a big mistake that you made. You probably won't get too heavily busted on it. But it was like, for those of us that are paying close attention and watching the score sheet, it was a bad move.
Jenny. Hey,
well,
you.
my Hey You is to Patty Hadju or Theresa Tam or anyone in the Liberal government, and ask them, when the hell are we getting...
Knock. Anybody there?
When are we getting our vaccines? We've now had reports that Germany, the UK, the US have all said by mid-December they should have their approvals done and they'll be able to get vaccinated. Germany has announced they purchased 600 million vaccines that they believe that they're going to have, doses that they're going to have by mid-December. In Health Committee last week, the Liberal health official, or the health officials, basically said approvals are still ongoing. It looks like by March 31st, this country may have 6 million doses. Obviously, there's now been some scrambling because Patty Hadju yesterday said that there's going to be an announcement in the next few days. So there's a lot of hoopla made that we had purchased the largest amount of vaccines per capita than around the world. But it doesn't seem that we're getting them anytime soon. So my Hey You is to the government. When the fuck are we getting our vaccines?
Excellent. Well, and just to keep it on the family, my Hey You is to Pierre Poilievre. Pierre Poilievre is talking a lot in great concern about the Great Reset and about what the Trudeau government may have planned in terms of remaking our society. I thought that back in the spring, everybody was looking at the gaps and fissures that we saw in our society that COVID had exposed. And we were looking forward to policies that might infill some of those and make us a better place when this was all over. So I know that the government's agenda is a little opaque at this moment, but I'd be interested in what Poilievre finds so concerning about this idea. Other than just calling it a globalist socialist plot, what is so unsettling about the idea that we'd be looking to make improvements to our society? That's my Hey You, Pierre Poilievre. Put some meat on the bones of what you're worried about. That's our show for today.
Wait.
I want to first of all...
Dave, wait. Before you go, I got to ask you something.
What's that?
I've sat here for 60 minutes with a red Sovine t-shirt on. You've not once made reference to it. Like...
I didn't want to embarrass you.
Come on. It's Red Sovine. The
I'm
truck
wearing a
stop
Dreamland-
troubadour.
I'm
The
wearing a
chronicler of
Dreamland
Middle
barbecue-
America.
I'm wearing a Dreamland barbecue shirt. Jenny, I picked this up at this unbelievable barbecue place in Alabama that we drove to one night when we were out. Reed and I and a bunch of guys were out on a golf trip. We drove to this thing, and this is the night that I discovered Red Bull and vodka. And
he also discovered some bushes.
Yeah, that was quite a day. Anyway, I want to thank Jill Engelman, our producer, and Spencer Sunshine, today's engineer of the podcast. Of course, I want to thank Jenny and Scott for being here. I want to thank Adrienne Spafford for joining us. I want to thank all of you for listening. I'm going to be back on the Zoom machine at noon today, interviewing my friend Ralph Goodale as he receives the honorary award from the Churchill Society and the Canadian Club of Toronto today. So you can get a lot of me if you want to tune into the Canadian Club. And this pod will be out. Well, why am I even talking about that? Because it'll be out when it's out. And we'll see you all next week. Thank you all for showing. Thank you all for listening. Take care.
Come on back, truckers, and talk to Teddy Bear.